Welcome, SASE family. My name is Parag Matawar. I'm the SASE Manager of Professional Programs, and I'll be your host this afternoon. We hope that each of you and your loved ones are safe, healthy, and happy this afternoon. We're extremely grateful to have you with us as we have another incredible guest speaker joining us. First off, I'd like to say on behalf of SASE that we're excited to welcome you back to the series. If this is your first time joining us, then a special welcome goes out to you, of course. As a brief introduction to SASE, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are the Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers. Our vision is that SASE becomes the go-to organization for talent and leadership development in science, technology, and engineering. Our mission is to prepare Asian heritage scientists, engineers, and technologists for success in the global business world, to celebrate diversity on campuses and in the workplace, and to provide our members with opportunities to contribute to their local communities. Currently, we've got SASE chapters in over 100 collegiate campuses, along with 6 professional city chapters. SASE as a whole hosts 6 regional conferences in the spring, along with our national conference every October. Now, before I turn it over to our guest speaker, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First off, the webinar is being recorded and then will be uploaded to YouTube. So you feel free to adjust your camera settings as you see fit. This afternoon's content will be approximately 45 minutes in length with 2 breaks for Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, we encourage you to ask via the chat, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as possible. All participants are muted, and so the chat is really the best way to ask to contribute to the Q&A. We will have also some interactive aspects. Dennis is going to be asking us a few questions and would like to invite you to share your responses using the Zoom polling feature. And lastly, get ready to take some notes. Dennis has a wealth of information, knowledge, and experience, and I think it goes without saying that we're all going to benefit from this talk. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dennis Hirotsu, 35 years with R&D, spanning multiple businesses at Procter Gamble. His global experience includes 13 years abroad in Asia and Europe. He also led the innovation capability for the R&D function, reporting to P&G's Chief Innovation and Technology Officer. Dennis supported the API community at P&G as the executive sponsor for APIs in R&D, and previously served on the SASE board of directors. Currently, Dennis in his retired life is a senior executive advisor for SASE Pro, following his retirement from Procter in 2016. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to present Dennis Hirotsu.
Okay, here we go. So thanks, Parag, for the introduction, and hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is a talk I've given in a lot of places at a lot of companies, including among some of the executives I've met at SASE. And the talk is really is helped by a lot of audience questions or comments. So we're going to take a lot of time to have you make those comments in the chat boxes. Okay, so let me do a little introduction so you know where my viewpoints are coming from my history. So first of all, I was born in Rio Vista, California, which is a small town in rural California. My parents were interned during World War II. They moved out, they got out of camp and basically settled in rural California. And I'm 3rd generation Japanese American, which means my grandparents came to the US. And I joined P&G in 1982. I didn't expect to be here more than 2 years, and 35 years later, I retired from P&G. Assignments in baby, home care, global hair color, corporate function, R&D. But 2 very formative assignments I had were in Asia. I spent 6 years expanding the Pampers business for baby care and the Always business, which we ran as Whisper, throughout the Asia region, and got to go to all the countries, including, work with all the countries, China, India, Philippines, Thailand, you name it. And then another 7 years where I basically ran the FemCare R&D organization for the Asia region. And from that, it gave me a lot of education, because as a 3rd generation Asian American, to actually see the countries and the cultures of the individual countries was very, very informative. Parag mentioned I was the API executive sponsor, so I've done a lot of mentoring with the API community at P&G. I retired in 2016, and I was a SASE board member, a SASE board member as Parag talked about. And one thing I saw was that although we had a number of Asians in R&D and in the company, the population at the lower levels was much, much higher than the population at the more senior levels. As I got into SASE, I realized this is a US phenomenon and not a Procter Gamble phenomenon. As a result of that, I volunteered. Just because I retired from P&G didn't mean I didn't want to do anything meaningful. And so one part of my passion work as a retiree has been to try to solve this issue. Okay, so before we get going, I'd like to do a little survey that I normally do when I do this talk amongst you. And I want you to choose your behavior. Okay, I want to start with your behavior at work. And if we can call up the survey in terms of how Asian or American is your personal behavior at work. So can you go ahead and click on what applies to you? And we'll take a minute to do this. So actually a fairly normal population here, relatively low predominant Asian, but in fact the middle 50-50 is the primary. And I'll tell you, this distribution is very normal when I do this talk around the United States of America, quite a spread of how people view their behavior at work. Okay, can we go to the next poll now? And this poll is, how Asian is your parents' behavior based on what you have seen? Okay, you can just choose one. Okay, and again, you now see the Asian greater than 90%, American less than 10% becomes over 60%. I've seen as high as 80%, but in general, this is also the trend we see, is the fact that most of the Asians who are working in corporate America today, they're all over the map, as we saw earlier. But when they think about their parents, right, in fact, the predominance of Asian behavior or culture is much, much stronger. And what we begin to see, and what I've seen, is that behavior of your parents and that interaction with your parents starts to really come through in moments of stress when you're working at a company like P&G or any corporation in the US. Okay, very helpful. So you guys kind of get the picture. You guys are a very normal crowd versus any group that I would normally present to. All right, so let's talk about the API leadership gap. Okay, so what I've done in my work at SASE is I've been recruiting executives because, and importantly, either executives who are Asian, who are like myself within 2 levels of the CEO at a major US company, or number 2, who are the executive sponsors of Asians, often not Asians, but they've been assigned the job of being the sponsor for the Asian ERG or community at their company. And I did this piece of research, and it was among 20 companies. It was about 30 Asian executives. We now have up to 45. I'm planning on redoing it. And we said, okay, we took Fortune 500 companies, and the reality is, okay, what is the population of APIs in your STEM workforce versus STEM executives, and STEM executives being within these 2 levels? And you see the 16% versus 6%, which is very common to what we see at the Procter Gamble company. And this 3x difference. And when I was working at P&G, to be honest, I didn't realize it was such a US phenomenon. And this actually surprised me. It doesn't surprise other people, because if I go to my old college, which is University of California, Berkeley, Asians predominate the STEM functions. I mean, there are Asians everywhere in the math department, the science department, the engineering departments. And pretty much anywhere you go in the US, it's not a problem to hire Asian scientists and engineers. But at the executive level, you have to go hunt for them, which I've been doing, and we've been having conversations. Okay, another piece of interesting data I found was from Ascend, who is an Asian professional organization like SASE, more focused on the business community, but they just said executive CEO minus 2 levels over total professionals, a similar survey to what I did. And what they found is this thing, and they call it the Management Parity Index. So this is the Bay Area, by the way, which is very diverse. I went to school in the California Bay Area. And what you see is for white, the MPI, it says 1.32 to 1.31. And what that means is for an index of, if they had exactly the same proportion at the lower levels as higher levels, it would be 1.0. So they are over-indexed by 30% at the executive levels. But what's very interesting about this research is Hispanics are over-indexed also. They're underrepresented in total. Hispanics are close to 15% of the US population. But even if you have 5% Hispanics in your organization, the likelihood to have 6% at the executive levels is very common. And also true of Blacks in the US, okay, which surprises many people. The only group that's under-indexed is Asian here in this racial analysis, right? 0.62 to 0.69, increasing very, very gradually, but still well below, which really means, for every one Asian or 10 Asians in the company, you have a 0.7 ratio at the senior executive level. So this leads to the question, what's going on? Why are there so little? And what I've done is I've interviewed many of these executives. I've also talked to the folks at Ascend who did this research, in addition, and look at their research. And these are the 4 that I found most predominant in all the conversations I've been having, because everyone like me is trying to mentor and sponsor their organizations to get more Asian leadership in their company. So the biggest one, number one, that I've seen is from these talks is lack of political and organizational savvy. The reality is these are the common factors that are limiting API professional development. At college and entry level, what really counts, it's very similar, it's a track meet, right? So you think about college, you take a midterm, you take a final, right? You get a score. In fact, before you even take the exam, they take the course, they tell you, oh, it's gonna be 30% midterm, 50% final, 10% homework, 10% class participation. So there's even a rubric to judge who goes to the top, who doesn't. Everyone takes the same test. You are scored, you get a certain score, boom, you get an A or A+. The same is true at entry level at companies. In general, you're given a technical assignment if you have a STEM career, and you have to solve these technical problems. Yeah, nobody gets the same problem. It's a little less of a track meet, but it's still very, very measurable. But once you start getting beyond 2 years, and especially beyond at the executive levels, you start going up to the very, very executive levels where you're managing risk, you're managing uncertainty. It's very much centered on the circle of people who are judging a group of larger people. Usually maybe a group of 6 people who are judging 100 people. And they all have different assignments. They're all doing it differently. And you cannot actually measure it purely quantitatively. And what we see among our mentees is very much a narrow focus on quantitative contributions. Hey, I should be rated the highest because I did more than that person. Well, let's look at the degree of difficulty. Let's look at what you contributed. Those are things that are being talked at in those circles, and understanding how that circle works to get advanced is crucially important. Many times we do mentoring and we find people go, well, that's not good. You should have a metric system. But the reality is it's impossible to have a fully metric system. So the reality of understanding how this works at your company is very, very important, and spending time on it is very important. Number 2, cultural deference to authority. So the treatment of the boss, and I put Asia historical because Asia is changing, in fact, but historically, and in many cases, the boss is a very, very high figure, even larger. They're treated as more important people than the other people in addition to their position. Whereas in US corporate leadership, the idea is, yes, you're the boss. Yes, you have more responsibility, but it really doesn't make you a superior human to everyone else, right? And it's indicated by how you even talk to the boss, right? So to be able to talk to the boss very collegially is very important in US corporations to really show that you can be a future leader. Whereas that's never done in an Asia historical context. Okay, number 3, ineffective communications and influencing skills. And the number one area that I see this coming through is in sharing viewpoints and opinions, right? So this is an area where there's really no right answer. It's not like, how efficient was the machine yesterday? Asians are very good at saying, hey, we have 80% efficiency last week. We got up to 90 the week before. Excellent. But when you start to go, okay, here's a dilemma. What's your view on that? We find with the Asian culture, there's much of this wandering and trying to cover all the bases, communicating all the uncertainties, and US corporate leadership is really, here's my point of view, here's why I think this way. It doesn't necessarily mean you believe you're right all the time, but to be able to communicate your point of view very, very directly is very, very, very important. Okay, and number 4, a challenge for us as Asians, and I've had all these challenges myself, and so have all of these executives, expectations of success and avoidance of failure. So this idea that, there's this one kid at SASE who said, hey, look, I'm almost done with college. I got 1 semester to go. I want to have a lot more fun. I have a 4.0 plus GPA. I want to take some easier courses, maybe get a B. And his mother told him, we're Asians, not Besians. My own daughter said to me that, in our family, an A minus is an F, for us, right? So it's like we tend to be a bit of perfectionists and avoiding failure because failure is shame. And this idea of before you do, you have to fully prepare. It's not a bad attribute, right? But at the same time, in corporate America, it doesn't always work. Let me talk more about that. Because in this corporate leadership area, you're basically going into the unknown most times. So people realize to get big rewards, you have to take bigger risk. You have to learn from failure. Failure is okay. A gentleman from Amazon, Pat Tang, said to me once, America is amazing because we accept failure, but that's what's great about America, because America has been a very innovative culture, right? And that failure culture is a part of it. So it's okay to fail, but fail smartly. Don't fail stupidly or don't fail lazily. But failure is not something you can totally avoid when you're going after big things. And then this other thing, which is instead of fully preparing for doing, just make sure you have confidence, develop capability to learn quickly on the job. As you saw in my history, or you heard in my history, I went from baby care. Okay, I never had a baby, by the way. I went to fem care. I'm a man, by the way, and I have 3 older brothers, so I don't know anything about fem care. And then after that, I went to hair color. I had never colored my hair. I had no idea what I was doing. There was no way to fully prepare, right? But at the end of the day, this confidence to learn quickly on the job. All of these Asian executives have also figured out how to do this, right? They've taken on some very dramatic changes in their career, opportunities that came up where they knew almost nothing, but these things on the right-hand side played out. Okay, so when we look back on it, really, it's an issue of culture. Almost none of these executives mentioned to me that they had to overcome racial bias per se, prejudice. However, they did have to overcome racial stereotyping. Okay, but it's very cultural stereotyping that occurs. So why does that happen? And I'm going to cover this next chart, which is a bit complex, and then take some questions. So a friend of mine, Vu Pham, who has the Spectrum organization, says, if you really dig in deep, go study US immigration history. So I actually spent a week studying US immigration history to understand what's going on. And it's basically summarized in this chart. So the number one point I always want people to realize is the US is British derived. And it's very important. Some people say the US is white, which is also true. But my observation and insight is it's British derived. And this is very important. In 1620 is when the Mayflower came, bringing a first big load of British people to the United States. In 1790, okay, about 170 years later, the US runs its first census. There are 2.5 million British Irish people, more than about 10 times the number of Germans, more than 25 times the number of Dutch, right? So the British were here first. They settled the culture. Yes, you notice in the US we speak English. This is going on. Then from 1831 to 1850 US immigration, British are still more than 2x than anyone. The French are finally showing up, but still 10x relative to the British Irish. And then from 1850 to 1930, the turn of towards the 20th century, the British are still in the lead, even though others are coming in greater quantities, including Italians at this point in time. And the point I make about this US is British derived is many people say it's white, but I've worked in the UK. I had a color organization in the UK, hair color. I worked in Germany. I worked in France. And the French and the Germans have a much harder time working in the US than the British. So this whole British origination really drives a big hunk of US culture. At P&G, the people who have the easiest time integrating into our P&G culture are from Australia, Canada, the UK, Ireland. It's very, very easy for them because they're all British derived or actually British countries. Okay, and the APIs are newcomers. So, why is our index behind Hispanics and African Americans? Well, if you really step back, in this first census, a very shameful part of our history, again highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement, Africans are a 1-to-3 ratio to the British Irish, but they're not free. They're coming as slaves on the plantations to basically drive the agriculture of the United States at that time. And think about it, it's only at the turn of the century, or before the turn of the century, the Civil War occurs over slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation. But even then, it's in the mid-1960s that the Civil Rights Act occurred. And up until that time, you can basically force blacks to not use a bathroom. You cannot serve them in a restaurant. They have these Jim Crow laws that basically purely discriminate against blacks, right? So the entire black experience in the US is frankly horrific when you look at it from a human rights standpoint. And that is where the bulk of blacks in the US come from, was through the slavery trade originated many, many centuries ago in the United States. It's a different thing, but it's been hundreds of years. Then we take the Hispanics, which I hadn't really appreciated, is the big move of Hispanics in the US was the US won the Mexican-American War in the middle of the 1800s. And the US acquired Texas, California, Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah, and big hunks of Utah. So the reality is we just basically invaded Mexico and took half of their country. So if you wonder why the names of so many of the cities in those states are Spanish, it's because they belong to Mexico. So, we are basically imperialist at this point in time as Americans. And Hispanics, a lot of them moved back to Mexico when this happened, but they basically owned the territory before it happened. And that really drives the growth of Hispanics in the US. Then let's talk about Asians. So you can see a long history for everybody except Asians. And people say, oh, the Asians, it was like the California gold rush. But the data that exists is the Chinese immigration at that time was only 23,000 people total for the California gold rush. But then what happens is the Chinese are now coming in for this and now starting to work on railroads and other labor things. And Americans are upset because they're taking too many jobs. So the US passes the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which is only supposed to last 10 years. They ended up keep extending it. It lasts 60 years. In the middle of this, they realized, wait a minute, there's a lot of other Asians coming. Here come the Japanese, here come some Indians, here come Filipinos. They're also taking our jobs. So the Immigration Act of 1924 is passed, which basically excludes Asians. But in addition, it wasn't just about Asians. They also wanted to exclude Italians, because you see that number's going up, and Greeks. So they also excluded Southern Europe. And the way they did it was they said, we're going to let people come into the US based on the population that's already here. So the population percentage that was already here from China and Asia was very, very small. And just to make sure the number was really low, they backdated it 50 years to the previous census, 50 years prior, to basically reduce Italian, Greek, Japanese, Indian, and the rest. Interestingly, after I did this, I learned that my family immigrated to the US in the early 1920s. So they came in just before this Immigration Act came about. And so that lasted about 40 years. And then everything changes with the Immigration Act of 1965. And what happens is after the Civil Rights Act, the US decides and Congress decides we shouldn't have racial-based quotas anymore. So we're going to make it more criteria-based. And at this time, so they say, what's the number one issue? We got to win the Cold War with Russia. It's post-World War II. So we're going to let in people who are basically escaping communism. In addition, we want to bring in scientists, engineers, and doctors, those kind of professionals, and also business people who want to be able to operate in a capitalistic environment like the United States, because we're going to win both the political in addition to the science war versus Russia. So what happens then is, here come the Asians. So I use this number, 1995 to 1998, because this is when a lot of the new hires at P&G are being hired when I presented this. But Asians suddenly go to the top of the chart, right? Over 1 million during this period of time. And you start to see how much bigger it is than the people coming from Europe and Africa. Mexico, of course, remains big, and Central South America. And a big part of what's happening now, the other priority here is family reunification. So although these scientists and engineers, the Vietnamese have come in because the US and South Vietnamese lost the Vietnamese war, it turns to communism. Many Vietnamese come in after this Immigration Act. And so what happens is now they're unifying families. The Asians who are now in the US can now bring their families over to the US. And this is what happens. So the Asian experience, and this is why I say the Asians are really newcomers. Before 1965, hardly any of us came here. And when I do this at companies, I ask people at this stage, how many of you had your ancestors came to the US before 1965, and it's always less than 10%. So most of us are from 1965. You compare that to the British, the Germans, the French, the Hispanics, the African Americans, it's completely different. There's one other very important factor here. The API population, therefore, is skewed. So we've all come in through this Immigration Act of 1965, most of us. So that's why there are so many scientists, so many engineers, and so many doctors in the United States of America who are Asian. My daughter went to med school. You would have thought you were in Asia. I mean, when I went to that graduation, it was incredible how many Asians there were, in fact, in that school. And so at the end of the day, we're getting a skewed population. And what I realized is, when I went to Asia, this may sound funny, I go to Asia and I go, there's like Asians who are like garbage collectors and street cleaners. And, we're doing all those jobs. It's very difficult for those people to come to the US unless they have a relative who's already gotten in through the criteria of the Immigration Act of 1965. So we have a very skewed population of Asians. And the last thing is, there's the South Asian factor. So when you think about Asians rising in the US, the most famous three, I believe, Asian CEOs are Sundar Pichai of Google, Satya Nadella of Microsoft, and Indra Nooyi, who was at Pepsi, all very successful, all Indian. And what I have found also, even at P&G, it's the same way. The Indians and South Asians have an easier integration into leadership at US companies. I attribute this, honestly, because of my time in Asia, to the British factor. The reality is the British were in India for 200 years. It took them 100 years to basically conquer India, Pakistan, parts of Sri Lanka, and then they stayed for 100 years and they ran the place, right? It's completely different than the US in the Philippines or the US in Japan. And so at the end of the day, they basically put their education system in place. The Indians are the one Asian culture, and the Pakistanis, who really thrive on debate, which is not done in the Asian culture, in the Northeast Asian culture. It's much, much easier for an Indian, from my view and my observation, to integrate into US culture. Okay, so a fairly complex chart, but I want to stop there and pause and get some comments or questions via Parag, because that frankly is what makes this presentation more interesting. So Parag, do you have anything yet?
We've got lots of questions, largely on prior to the immigration table. If you'd like me to go through some of those.
Go ahead, let's take a few.
So one of them you already addressed is the South Asian factor, and so I'm gonna pass on that one. The question is it a lack of political savviness, or is it being included into the conversations or having the same mentors? That referred to a slide a few back.
Okay, so so the point of view I would share is that's not an or, it's more of a therefore. So the observation that I have, and even in talking to a number of my peers, is the ability to be politically savvy is actually what gets you into those conversations. A lack of political savviness, even for white people, doesn't get you into those conversations if you don't have political savvy. And what I want to tell you, what I want to say is I'd like to demystify, and because the other thing I've learned about our Asian culture is when we hear the word political, everyone's like, ooh, it's dirty. Ooh, it's nasty. Oh, it's not real work. It's just political. Ooh, I don't like politics, right? But to me, political just means human, right? So there is the objective, there's the numerical, there's the technical, there's the quantitative, but there's also a human side of everything that we do. And leadership is very much a human activity. Therefore, it's a very political activity. You have to address the human need, and people aren't all the same. You need to know how to build relationships. You need to know how to motivate people, how to inspire people. It's a political activity. It's a human activity. Okay, Parag, anything else?
Oh, tons. You got a lot of people commenting just how informational that chart was. So I think we all thank you for that. How can I better understand and process the difference between feedback, discussion, and criticism in the workplace?
Okay, feedback, discussion, and criticism in the workplace. Well, criticism is a feedback, right? Is a part of feedback. If you want to say, is it unfair? At the end of the day, what I believe we have to teach at SASE. Oh, and by the way, one of the things I'm doing now is, just to keep my learning going, I actually run the new hire training for the product supply, manufacturing, engineering, and R&D organizations at P&G. So I can try things out. And what I've learned is the real key to getting good feedback is the ability to turn it into a dialogue, a relationship building dialogue. Because what I've found happens is sometimes people are wrong, right? They say, you're just not getting enough done. They just don't know you're getting enough done. But then a really bad thing to do is turn it into a debate. Look at all the things I've been doing. You haven't been paying attention to what I'm doing. Da, 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 da. It just doesn't lead anywhere good. Versus how do you turn that type of observation and feedback into dialogue? And if you're able to do that and turn it into dialogue and a conversation that builds the relationship, like, thank you for that. I see it a little bit differently, okay? Here's some of the things I've been doing, but maybe that hasn't been visible, right? Were you able to see those, and how do I make them more visible? It's very different than debating. You start doing things like that with your management, they start to trust you more and give you more feedback. They give you more direct feedback. Because what we don't always appreciate is most of the white managers, and white men especially, are walking on eggshells a lot of time when they talk to racial minorities, and they tend to ice down their feedback. But if you build that relationship and trust and dialogue, you get the really, really of what people are saying, right? And so I think that's really, really important, to turn everything, critique, feedback, all of it into a dialogue that builds relationships with your management. Okay, Parag, maybe we could do one more.
Sure. Here's a good one. APA executives are not seen as actively promoting APAs as compared to other ethnicities. Any comments on what needs to be done differently here?
Well, okay, so, yeah, so, and I might be accused of being one of those people, okay? So there's a couple of viewpoints. I see the same thing, okay? So among the API executives, all of them, including me, want to be quote unquote objective, right? Objective. One thing to know is that when you're, and there's some data on this that I've uncovered, which is if you're an executive and you are seen as promoting your race above others in a non-objective way, your credibility goes down significantly, right? So there's always this risk of doing that, right? And to be quite honest, right, I find a lot of our Asian leaders are very much focused on avoiding that phenomenon, right? At the same time, very much supporting Asians who they view are deserving of those levels, and very much committed to mentoring and doing those kinds of things.
So Dennis, we've got easily 15 more questions, and so
let's keep moving, because the next thing is very important. Okay, and the next thing is a bit more controversial even than where we've gotten so far. So in talking to these folks, I've developed a bit of a model of what I've seen all of us have done. Okay, is this, and the point is cultural agility, demonstrating US leadership behaviors and skills while staying true to your values and identity. And what I propose then is that we start to separate in our minds values from behaviors and skills, right? So when you really boil Asian values down, respect for authority, humility, hard work, persistence, collective over the individual, bringing pride, not shame, onto your company, your family, your group. I mean, I think whenever I ask, like, who thinks these are Asian values, we generally get a very broad, everyone raises their hand. Yeah, these are things that people think about when they talk about Asians. But I can tell you, at the time of my retirement, and they're still there, David Taylor is the CEO of Procter Gamble, a white gentleman. Kathy Fish is the Chief Technology Officer and Innovation Leader for the company, also Caucasian. They embody all of these values. In fact, they embody all of these values, maybe even more than some of the Asians that I know. So Asians don't own these values, but these are very, very common in Asian culture. However, What I see now is that these values completely manifest differently in Asian behaviors versus US workplace behaviors. So there's a completely different behavioral connection that goes with those values. And the ability, based on context, to either apply the Asian behavior or the US behavior will lead to your success at a US company in basically unlocking your potential. So let me give an example of that. Respecting authority. So respecting authority in Asian culture, defer to authority as superior. I mean, you know, taking to a extreme, when I go to Asia, if I'm the boss, they actually want to carry my bag for me, right? They want to just, you know, treat me as a superior. They don't challenge me directly, right? They execute as directed. I give them something to do, they get it done. They avoid strong eye-to-eye contact, right? Because that's viewed as disrespectful, but it's disrespectful in Asian culture. In the US, we still respect authority. There's a role difference. You have to respect your boss. You know, you don't go to your boss and go, "Hey, dude, how's it going?" Right? You really, you know, give them respect, but you're equal as people. You don't have to treat them as a superior individual. You dialogue. If they give you something that you don't understand, you can say, "Can you tell me more about that?" Right? Because I basically deserve to know what the context of this project is. And you debate respectfully. So, if there's something you don't, you can say, "Hey, I see it differently. Let me offer you my viewpoint on that topic." Boom, right? And you can offer it. You're still being polite, but in fact, you can use a whole different set of behaviors. Now, the problem is I've noticed we mentor so many Asians to like, you got to speak out, you got to go do this, you know, you got to do this. But then what we don't fully appreciate is what I call the no-go zone. So if you do this without skill, or without a real good perceptiveness of the culture and how people understand it, you go into the no-go zone and it turns out very bad. It comes across as aggressive, it comes across as pushy, it just doesn't come across well. You know, and I'll give you an example. I mean, I once had a Chinese woman who I gave a raise to. And, you know, I gave her a raise and she goes, well, I go, don't look very happy. She goes, no, I'm fine. I go, this is a pretty good raise. You don't seem happy. And you go, I'm fine. I go, look, you know, I've been talking to you. You got to speak out, right? And so then what she says to me is, okay, yeah, okay, this raise is fine, but it's 2 months later than my peer. You told me that I'm a, you know, top development candidate. She heard the same thing. She got it 2 months before me. So I really think you've been lying to me this whole time. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's take a time out here, right? You know, and the reality is I come to appreciate that just telling someone to do something without the skills and the perceptiveness to do it is really, really can lead to bad outcomes, right? So at the end of the day, you know, I'd like to see us develop more of our community to do this with skill, do it with perceptiveness so they could be successful. This plays out across all of these things. You know, you often tell it for humility. You often will see it in Asian. Hey, that was really good. And they'll go, oh, it was really the team. You know, it was really, oh, you know, let me tell you how good Joe was and how good Sandy was, right? Where in US culture, it's very reasonable to say, hey, that was a good job. Well, thank you. You know, I worked really hard on delivering these. Let me tell you great things the team also did and how it all came together. That would be a very, very good way to do that in a collective way with humility. Often for Asians, hard work, perseverance is you run into obstacles, you just plow through them, you just, you know, work hard, nail them. But in truth, in US workplace behavior, you work very hard, you find an issue. Oh my gosh, this is going to take double the time. It's very good to go talk to your boss and say, hey, look, here's what we found in this work. It's going to take double the time. Is it still a priority, right? Or letting you know it's going to take double the time. That's why this isn't happening, or this other thing isn't going to happen at that time. That's considered a very US workplace type approach to that, which is very different than Asian. So there's just a number of these factors that occur. And one of the things I'm hopeful through the SASE organization is we're going to build really good development programming to address some of these things. But on top of that, the other thing I want to say is I find our individual characteristics don't come through. Personality, passion, strengths, because even those show up differently in Asian cultural behavior versus US workplace behavior. So an example, you know, I find so many of our US managers believe Asians are introverted. They think many of us are introverted, when in fact, many are extroverted. One of the comments I made to Parag yesterday on this, or 2 days ago, was, if you really want to know whether an Asian's introverted or extroverted, talk to them about Asian restaurants and Asian food. And you'll see some people who you thought were very introverted become extremely extroverted in how excited they are, how enthusiastic they are, how clear they are about what they like, what they don't like. But the reality is if we don't learn to present this in a US cultural behavioral context, people will not understand us, right, at the end of the day. Okay, so this is my last heavy content slide. This gets a lot of controversy, so I'm hoping some of the comments and questions are really, like tough. Let's go to that. Parag, do we have any others?
We have a ton. So let's go with this one. Do first-generation Asians in the US have a disadvantage over second and third-generation Asians?
In general, yes. Okay. And in general, this is a harder challenge for first generation than second, in my observation, because of the cultural agility required. But one of the other things I would say here is, what I've learned heavily is it also depends on your parents, on how difficult this transition is. So even some first generation Asians, I've learned their parents actually encourage them to argue with them, debate, right? To really explore, to take risk, right? Oh, you got a few B's, that's okay. You took some chances. Some, like that would be shocking from my upbringing. Believe me, that was not my upbringing, but some people tell me that, so that transition to a US leadership culture is easier for those people. The one thing I will say is, and I get to see new hires at the Procter Gamble company, and today they are second and third generation, a third generation like me, and very similar to me. When they come to the company, they don't realize how Asian they are. Our parents somehow, there's a chip in there. Our grandparents and parents have a little thing in our brain that turns on in stressful moments. And more than anything, we turn to our Asian cultural behavior because it's what we grew up with. So I wouldn't say that the second, third have it made, but it's definitely harder for the first. With that said, the first can also overcome this, as you see in many of these CEOs I talked about are first generation Asians, right? So they've learned to do this also. Okay, Parag, next.
I think to your point as well, Dennis, first generation Asians know that they have those Asian cultural behaviors, whereas a lot of times second and third, myself included, take a little while to realize it.
Yes. Yeah.
Not many people are extroverted or have an outgoing personality. Sometimes I feel you need to be loud to have people's attention in the corporate world. How do you balance between having your voice heard, at the same time avoid the perception of being aggressive or bossy? And those are more unfairly used. Those words are more unfairly used for female than they are males.
Yes, that's the combination, so the hardest challenge is for Asian females. It's actually documented that females is harder than males and Asians is harder than, non-Asian, to be quite honest. So how do you do that? It's really the skill perceptiveness point, in my view, is you have to actually experiment, as all of these executives, including myself, have done, with ways to do it and focus on skill building. A woman, shouldn't talk like a man, to be honest. You can't. I'll be honest, right? So some of my Asian tendencies, like I go to a meeting, join a new team, and some people go, oh, some people just start talking right away, like trying to contribute. It takes me a while to warm up. It's just who I am, and I think it's a part of my Asian wanting to be perfect and smart. And I don't expect any of us to overcome it 100%, and nor do totally behave in a different way 100%, nor do any of these other executives. But we've developed enough agility and we've developed enough skill to perceive how to do it in a way that would receive well. So that's all I could say. And my real hope is through development programming. And by the way, one of my real issues is I don't think we have enough Asian development programming to address some of these issues, because all of us, I can tell you, the executives that I've interviewed and myself, think there's so much more potential in our community that is actually showing up in the executive ranks. However, there's not enough solid development programming to really accomplish that. Okay,
We're
Parag?
going to go with one more, and then we'll move forward. And I think if you have some time afterwards, maybe we can take a few more.
Okay.
Last one, and I know you've definitely got a story behind this one. Should we integrate more into American culture, or should American culture be more accepting of diverse backgrounds and behaviors?
Yes. My answer to that is yes. And so what I have observed, okay, and I think is happening in the US, and I'll start with women. So, women have basically had to be, quite honestly, press a little harder in the US corporate culture, right? Be a bit more assertive to really rise to the top. But what I have found at P&G in particular, where they've done, I think, a very good job with women, is the women have changed the culture in the executive ranks. Because to change the executive culture, I don't see that you change it from the bottom up. I have not seen that happen. What I have seen is women rise because there are some who have this agility, right? They get there, and then they basically become a part of the power system, the brokers, the people in the circle who are rating all of these other people at the next level down, at the next level down, to really create this balance. And it's created a fantastic diversity at P&G. To be quite honest, in my role at P&G, when I got to this level, I was able to help the R&D leadership group understand who is really, really strong in our Asian community, right? Some of them you're missing because you're culturally missing it. Others, no, you're not really missing it, right? They're going to be that level. It's great. They're wonderful employees, but no, they don't really have that executive potential because we've been working with them for a while. So, number one, we're going to need some people who have a lot of agility to get to the top to really get there. And then they will change the culture from the inside. At least that's the approach I've seen that works very, very well. And these gentlemen and women who I've met through the SASE Executive Forum are also trying to do the same thing.
Wonderful.
Okay, let me go ahead and move on because I'm very conscious of time.
Very close. Yep.
I'm a retiree, so I have more time than most of the people on this call. So I want to talk. So with this, and the reason I did this work was to just understand how can we help this community. So I come with a mission, which is unlock the leadership potential of APIs in STEM. And the reason this is the rallying cry, as I mentioned earlier, is all of these executives are a bit frustrating because they think we have so much more potential in our community that we got to find a way to unlock it. Okay, which is why I did this research. And building awareness and skills to lead with cultural agility is important, right? So the API leadership gap, okay, why should companies care? And this is my pitch to companies always: unlock the potential, increase the leadership pool. More and more and more, the Asian population in STEM in companies is growing, right? So we want to increase the effectiveness of in-house training and development. Almost every company, at least the major companies, have leadership training, communication training. But the truth is they're getting less out of it with their Asian population than with others. And with some supplement like SASE is trying to provide, that training can be much more effective when they give it to their Asian community. Also increase the diversity of perspective, right? Our background is not a liability, it's a strength. Everybody wants to win in Asia now. Asia is a top priority for every single company that I know of. And the ability of people who can have this agility of background and also even behavior. And I can tell you, in my time in Japan, I wasn't, my joke is I really didn't understand my mother until I went to Japan. After I went to Japan, I understand my mother and grandparents very, very well. And in fact, I realized that I could draw on that. So when I'm operating with a CEO of a Japanese company in a meeting, I can basically show cultural agility to show him respect, even though I'm American. This diversity of perspective is a real value to US companies. Okay. Also, we want to foster a sense of belonging, success models to motivate, retain people like you, right? And nobody wants to lose their Asian employees. Asian employees are beloved at these companies, at all of your companies. We want you to feel like you belong and that you have success models to look up to. And then, of course, advantage in recruiting. This is a company, we encourage groups at SASE, companies to come to SASE, because by being there, I've even heard new hires say, I want to work at one of these companies because they're actually investing in Asians in their company, right? So the SASE group is actually a fairly high profile group of companies, and they're ones that are really serious about developing their Asians. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Back to Parag. If you want to, stick around afterwards and ask a few more questions, we can do that.
Thank you, Dennis, for that. I think we all got a ton out of that. So building on what Dennis was talking about with the Asian cultural values, those 5 that are listed, and Dennis talked at length about them. We've got those strong cultural values that are highly consistent with U.S. leadership, but it's how they translate into their behaviors, and skills that really can be inconsistent with U.S. leadership behaviors. So we at SASE Pro have put a lot of work into trying to figure out how to approach this challenge, how to organize around it. And so we've developed what we call a leadership competency framework. And we put this into 5 different buckets. Bucket number 1 is leading yourself for growth. Bucket number 2 is leveraging effective 360-degree relationships. Number 3 is leading impactful and influential communication. Then there's leading high-performance organizations, and there's leading business inflection. And again, this is our approach to how to organize all the training and skill building that is available or needs to be available for our community to really be able to reach our potential. So you can see the types of skill areas with each of those. We have chosen to organize our national conference around those 5 leadership competency areas. And I'll talk a bit about the national conference in a little bit. So we've got 5 tracks of programming, and then we've got a separate one for those senior executives that Dennis was mentioning early on in his talk, because ultimately they need their own set of training as well to be able to achieve their goals, but then also to be able to support those of us who are still climbing. So we put a lot of thought into it. We have 50+ hours of live streamed, fast-paced interactive content in our conference in late October. We've got training sessions, workshops, executive panels, keynotes, networking, quick topics, and all sorts of things that we are designing around the virtual experience. Normally we would be doing this in person, but as all of us know, the world's changed very dramatically in the past 4 or 5 months. And so we're adjusting with it, and all of our work has adjusted as well. So we're partnering with all these companies here that you can see, top API leadership trainers. They know what they're doing, and we bring them all into one spot for this professional track at SASE Pro National Conference. Registration is going to open up here this weekend, and you can go to conference.saseconnect.org for that. Now, I've only touched on the tips really of that leadership competency framework. The full details are actually going to be shared in our next webinar. And the registration is now open. And if Roland, if you're able to paste that into the chat, that'd be wonderful. If you've got it, otherwise you can go to saseconnect.org/webinar and it will be there shortly. So Uday is going to talk through this leadership competency framework. Uday is a retired director from Procter Gamble in R&D, and he's going to share that prototype and how we are framing and framing all of the work that we do at SASE Pro around this framework. Registration is free, just as it was with this one, so please do join us with that. We'll also talk a lot more about the national conference and how everything's going to be organized there. Lastly, in our final few minutes, I'd like to go ahead and get some feedback from you. We are planning on hosting more live webinars once a month to support our community. This has really been a fantastic series that we've developed initially because of COVID, and now it's proven to show that our community actually values this content, as witnessed by the 220 some people who showed up today. So we're planning on continuing this ongoing for the foreseeable future. If you'd like to stay connected, go to the website there, join the mailing list. And if you also know someone who would be a good fit for hosting a future webinar, please do reach out and let us know that. So one last quick poll just on the presentation itself. So there are 2 polls in here. If you could go through and answer it. The first one is overall, how would you rate this 1 to 10, with 10 being the best? And the second one being, how likely is it that you would recommend it to a friend? So we'll give it a few minutes for some responses to come in. And you can keep going while I finish up here. given that we are at time. If you'd like to be more involved with SASE, we would like to invite you to join our family. We continue to grow, and we're always constantly striving to add more content and more value to our members. There's lots of ways that you can get involved, whether you're on campus or in the workplace, or you just want to volunteer. Overall, you know, we're a community and we're serving our community. So the clearest, tangible way to connect with us is through our conference. That'll be throughout the month of October, as you can see the dates here, starting with SASE Hack, the collegiate track of the national conference, the STEM career fair, and then the professional track of the national conference that we referenced earlier in this webinar. And lastly, for more information, you can find us on the web, all the social media accounts. You can send us emails at ideas@SASE Connect. And if you want to talk about Pro specifically, you know, many of the folks who are on this webinar were connected through their company. If you weren't connected through your company, if your ERG wants to get involved, reach out to us at pro@saseconnect.org. That's all for the recording. Roland, you can stop tape, and thank you so much, everyone, for connecting with us. If you want to hang out for a little bit, you can. Otherwise, we will see you soon.